Hello, I'm George Chryssides from York St John University. The title of my presentation is Beyond Armageddon, and I'm going to look at the role of fiction in Jehovah's Witnesses' end-time beliefs. This week has seen the publication of my new book on Jehovah's Witnesses, A New Introduction, published by Bloomsbury. In my previous book, Jehovah's Witnesses, Continuity and Change, the last sentence read, "For the Jehovah's Witnesses, Armageddon is not the end of the world, it is only the beginning." Because after Armageddon, which is the spiritual battle between Christ and Satan, there is a transition into a new world which will become restored as a perfect paradise. The transition won't be instant, but involves a timetable of events as predicted in the Bible, which is the Jehovah's Witnesses' source of authority. Some of you may be familiar with Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins' Left Behind series, in which they look beyond the rapture and what might happen to those who weren't caught up into heaven with Christ. LaHaye and Jenkins assumed a timetable of events that differs substantially from that of Jehovah's Witnesses. So what if the Jehovah's Witnesses got it right and not mainstream Protestant fundamentalists? One person who has had a go at exploring this idea is an author. He is a Jehovah's Witness called E.K. Jonathan, and he's written a number of books, 5 of which are about end times, and I want particularly to focus on his work, The Unrighteous. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses end time calendar goes like this. There's the gathering of the 144,000, which began in 1914. Then there will be the Great Tribulation, which precedes Armageddon. And then Christ's 1,000-year reign, the millennium, begins. During that period, there will be a resurrection of those who don't belong to the 144,000, including the return of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then when the millennium ends, Satan will be released for a short time and then bound and disposed of permanently, and then we're finally into the new world. So the Unrighteous explores these ideas, and it does so by envisaging people being reunited in welcome centers. There are 4 classes of people altogether at the time of Armageddon. There will be the anointed class who will have gone up by the time Armageddon takes place. There will be people who are still alive during Armageddon. There will be those who are dead but have been in the truth, and they're the ones who will be progressively resurrected in reverse chronological order, the society teaches. And then there are unrighteous returners. Some individuals, not everyone who has died, will be given a second opportunity to hear the truth and to respond to it. And if they respond appropriately, then they will be part of the new world. So it's the unrighteous returners that Jonathan explores. And in this welcome center, there are a number of people that are brought back. Charlie and Naomi and Daniel, their son, and Sophie, they're actually welcomers. They've made it to the new world. They've lived through Armageddon. But there are 5 people that have been brought back. Jack is an uncouth soldier. Harold is a real challenge because he's a professor of evolutionary biology, which is quite contrary, of course, to the society's teachings. Adrena is a former drug addict. There's a Chinese woman called Li Ping, and Hyde is a somewhat feral youth. So they've got a challenge on their hands there. Well, the Welcome Center is situated in a very low density population there are only 100 people who live in this town. Although there have been billions who have died, remember that only a few will be resurrected. There are only 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. Of course, they're not the only ones that will be part of the new world, but the new world will be considerably smaller in number than those who have lived on Earth. So, the phenomenon of returners creates two sets of problems. First of all, there are problems for the welcomers. They've got to deal with a number of people that aren't quite suited to the new world, at least not at the time the novel begins. Equally, from the point of view of the returners, because they're not suited to this new world, they first of all wonder where they are. They've woken up into this strange environment that they're not expecting. What sort of place is it? And some of them think that it might be a psychological experiment that's happening to them. Some think that it's a prison camp, and they've got this conundrum. Where are we? What are we doing? What are we to do? And Jack and Harold, thinking it's a prison camp, try to escape from it. And then the plot begins. How do you bring them back and what happens to them? So that's the scenario. And I want to focus on three features of this new society that Jonathan envisaged: social conditions, language, and technology. So what are the social conditions going to be like? Jonathan envisages a low density population. They're small communities. There's also going to be no money for commercial transactions. It's a perfect world, so everyone is honest. You simply take what you need, even what you want, because you'll be moderate in what you choose. But Hyde, the feral youth, doesn't understand this, and he starts going around stealing. So there's a problem there. He's not behaving as expected. The second problem that I want to focus on, which is a bit more complicated, is language. According to the Bible, people spoke different languages because of the story of the Tower of Babel. Humans constructed this high tower, and Jehovah disapproved. So the tower was destroyed, and the men and women who were involved fled worldwide and spoke different languages. So what will happen in the new world? Presumably people will communicate with each other somehow. On the other hand, they're not all going to speak the same language, because the book of Revelation talks about a great crowd of all peoples and tongues. So how do you get around that problem? Well, Jonathan envisages a miraculous kind of translation system. Leaping speaks in Chinese. Adrena thinks she's hearing her in perfect English, and vice versa. So they're all speaking their own language, but the languages aren't confounded. And then at the same time, when they're praising God, then these people who are part of this great crowd will praise him in their own tongue. So that's the problem solved, at least according to Jonathan. And then what about technology? When you read Watchtower literature, and particularly if you look at the illustrations, they're all very low tech, like the one that's on screen at the moment. The only thing that's not in the Bible there are the hard hats. But they seem to be using hammers and planks of wood. They don't seem to use power tools or diggers or things like that. So what's the level of technology going to be like? Well, Jonathan's answer to this, in my view, is not terribly satisfactory. People go around on bicycles. There's a limited supply of old-fashioned wired telephones, but there aren't computers, there aren't trains, there aren't buses, and people go around in bicycles. Of course, bicycles aren't biblical either. On the other hand, at the beginning of the novel, Charlie and Naomi, the welcomers, arrive in a conventional aircraft. And at one point in the plot, Jack and Harold find a plane. It's a solar-powered plane because the New World is environmentally conscious, but it's a plane. So there's this kind of ambiguity that you get in Jonathan. Is the world that's to come going to be high-tech or not so high-tech? And that's unresolved. Well, something should be said about the value of this kind of literature. So why has Jonathan written it? What function does it serve? Well, Jonathan says that when he talked to people before embarking on his writing projects, he got a lot of encouragement from his fellow witnesses. When I've spoken to witnesses about Jonathan's books, they're not so enthusiastic. They say, well, we'd prefer to read what Watchtower publications say. They're not so keen on somebody writing outside the society and without the society's approval. But I think the novel serves a number of purposes. First of all, it helps to clarify Jehovah's Witnesses' eschatology. So you can read about it in Watchtower publications, but it does help to see how it works as a piece of narrative. And it helps to inspire confidence that a new world is conceivable and that it's feasible. But on the other hand, as I said, it's not official Watchtower teaching. So one can't take it as definitive of what we can expect in the new world. But it does enable those witnesses who like this sort of story to contemplate the new world. You can see it in action, you can see it happening, and it can be an expectation. You can live in hope for the new world. And a lot of witnesses that I've spoken to say, well, in the new world, something that is a problem for us will be resolved when this new society comes into being. But not only that, the new world isn't just an expectation of hope. The new world is a model for living. So we ought to be living, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, as if we were in the new world. We should be honest in our dealings. We should be kind and loving. We should do all the things that we would do if we were already there. So contemplating the new world is a kind of model for how we ought to behave. It's also worth mentioning one or two things that Jonathan doesn't say in his book. He doesn't mention the unrighteous who don't accept. So sorry to spoil the story, but all the unrighteous in the village that Jonathan envisages, they actually do accept the truth. What if they don't? Would they just disappear? Would they be destroyed? What would happen? And we don't get that in the novel. We don't see the faithful men of old, as they're called. We don't see the return of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, presumably because people are returning in reverse chronological order. And that's necessary, according to witness teaching, to enable recognition. I would recognize my mother and father if they were restored into the new world. I wouldn't recognize Julius Caesar or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob very readily. In Jonathan's story, the new world is only 200 years into its existence. So we don't get the end of the millennium, we don't get the loosing of Satan and the rebinding of him, and we don't get right to the end where the millennium finishes and this eternal, everlasting paradise takes place. So opinion is divided about Jonathan. Some think that it's great to be able to envisage the new world in this way. Others are not so sure and prefer simply to rely on what the Watchtower says. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for your attention, and I hope it's been of interest.